Section 4 of the Sorrows of Young Werther. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, as read by Rob DeLorenzo in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Section 4. August 8. Believe me, dear Wilhelm, I did not allude to you when I spoke so severely of those who advise resignation to inevitable fate. I did not think it possible for you to indulge such a sentiment. But in fact, you are right. I only suggest one objection. In this world, one is seldom reduced to make a selection between two alternatives. There are as many varieties of conduct and opinion as there are turns of feature between aquiline nose and a flat one. You will, therefore, permit me to concede your entire argument, and yet contrive means to escape your dilemma. Your position is this, I hear you say: either you have hopes of obtaining Charlotte, or you have none. Well, in the first case, pursue your course, and press on to the fulfillment of your wishes. In the second, be a man, and shake off a miserable passion, which will enervate and destroy you. My dear friend, this is well and easily said. But would you require a wretched being, whose life is slowly wasting under a lingering disease, to dispatch himself once by the stroke of a dagger? Does not the very disorder which consumes his strength deprive him of the courage to effect his deliverance? You may answer me, if you please, with a similar analogy. Who would not prefer the amputation of an arm to the peril of life by doubt and procrastination? But I know not if I am right, and let us leave these comparisons. Enough. There are moments, Wilhelm, when I could rise up and shake it all off, and when, if I only knew where to go, I could fly from this place. The same evening. My diary, which I have for some time neglected, came before me today, and I am amazed to see how deliberately I entangled myself, step by step. To have seen my position so clearly, and yet to have acted like such a child! Even still, I behold the result plainly, and yet have no thought of acting with greater prudence. August 10. If I were not a fool, I could spend the happiest and most delightful life here. So many agreeable circumstances, and of a kind to ensure a worthy man's happiness, are seldom united. Alas, I feel it too sensibly. The heart alone makes our happiness. To be admitted into this most charming family, to be loved by the father as a son, and by the children as a father, and by Charlotte. Then the noble Albert, who never disturbs my happiness by any appearance of ill humour, receiving me with the heartiest affection, and loving me, next to Charlotte, better than all in the world. Wilhelm, you would be delighted to hear us in our rambles and conversations about Charlotte. Nothing in the world can be more absurd than our connection, and yet the thought of it often moves me to tears. He tells me sometimes of her excellent mother, how, upon her deathbed, she had committed her house and children all to Charlotte, and had given Charlotte herself in charge to him, how, since that time, a new spirit had taken possession of her, how, in care and anxiety for their welfare, she became a real mother to them, how every moment of her life was devoted to some labour of love in their behalf. And yet her mirth and cheerfulness have never forsaken her. I walk by his side, pluck flowers by the way, arrange them carefully into a nosegay, and fling them into the first stream I pass, and watch them as they float gently by. I forget whether I told you that Albert is to remain here. He has received a government appointment, and with a very good salary, and I understand he is in high favour at court. I have met few persons so punctual and methodical in business. August 12. Certainly Albert is the best fellow in the world. I had a strange scene with him yesterday. I went to take leave of him, for I took it into my head to spend a few days in these mountains, from where I now write to you. As I was walking up and down his room, my eye fell upon his pistols. "Lend me those pistols," I said, "for my journey." "By all means," he replied, "if you will take the trouble to load them, for they only hang there for form." I took one of them down, and he continued, "Ever since I was near suffering from my extreme caution, I will have nothing to do with such things." I was curious to hear the story. "I was staying," he said, "some 3 months ago at a friend's house in the country. I had a brace of pistols with me, unloaded, and I slept without anxiety. One rainy afternoon, I was sitting by myself doing nothing, when it occurred to me that I do not know how that house might be attacked, that we might require the pistols, that we might, in short, you know how we go on fancying, when we have nothing better to do. I gave the pistols to the servant, to clean and load. He was playing with the maid, and trying to frighten her when the pistol went off. God knows how. The ramrod was in the barrel, and it went straight through her right hand, and shattered the thumb. I had to endure all the lamentation, and to pay the surgeon's bill. So since that time, I have kept all of my weapons unloaded. But, my dear friend, what is the use of prudence? We can never be on our guard against all possible dangers. However, now you must know I can tolerate all men until they come into however, for it is self-evident that every universal rule must have its exceptions. But he is so exceedingly accurate that, if he only fancies he has said a word too precipitate, or too general, or only half true, he never ceases to qualify or to modify, till at last he appears to have nothing at all. Upon this occasion, Albert was deeply immersed in his subject. I ceased to listen to him, and became lost in reverie. With a sudden motion, I pointed the mouth of the pistol to my forehead, over the right eye. "What do you mean?" cried Albert, turning back the pistol. "It is not loaded," I said. "And even if not," he answered with impatience, "what can you mean? I cannot comprehend how a man can be so mad as to shoot himself, and the bare idea of it shocks me." "But why should anyone," I said, "in speaking of an action, venture to pronounce it mad, or wise, or good, or bad? What is the meaning of all this? Have you carefully studied the secret motives of our actions? Do you understand? Can you explain the causes which occasion them, and make them inevitable? If you can, you will be less hasty with your decision." "But you will allow," said Albert, "that some actions are criminal, let them spring from whatever motives they may." I granted it, and shrugged my shoulders. "But still, my good friend," I continued, "there are some exceptions here too. Theft is a crime, but the man who commits it from extreme poverty, with no design but to save his family from perishing, is he the object of pity, or that of punishment? Who shall throw the first stone at a husband, who, in the heat of just resentment, sacrifices his faithless wife and her perfidious seducer? Or at the young maiden who, in her weak hour of rapture, forgets herself in the impetuous joy of love? Even our laws, cold and cruel as they are, relent in such cases, and withhold their punishment." "That is quite another thing," said Albert, "because a man under the influence of violent passion loses all of his power of reflection, and is regarded as intoxicated or insane." "Oh, you people of sound understandings," I said, smiling, "are ever ready to exclaim extravagance and madness and intoxication. You moral men are so calm and so subdued. You abhor the drunken man and detest the extravagant. You pass by like the Levite, and thank God, like the Pharisee, that you are not like one of them. I have been more than once intoxicated. My passions have always bordered on extravagance, and I am not ashamed to confess it, for I have learned from my own experience that all extraordinary men, who have accomplished great and astonishing actions, have ever been decried by the world as drunken or insane. And in private life, too, Is it not intolerable that no one can undertake the execution of a noble or generous deed without giving rise to the exclamation that the doer is intoxicated or mad? Shame upon you! This is another of your extravagant humours, said Albert. You always exaggerate a case, and in this matter you are undoubtedly wrong, for we are speaking of suicide, which you compare with great actions, when it is impossible to regard it as anything but a weakness. It is much easier to die than to bear a life of misery with fortitude. I was on the point of breaking off the conversation, for nothing puts me so completely out of patience as the utterance of a wretched commonplace when I am talking from my inmost heart. However, I composed myself, for I had often heard the same observation with sufficient vexation, and I answered him, therefore, with a little warmth. You call this a weakness. Beware of being led astray by appearances. When a nation, which has long groaned under its intolerable yoke of a tyrant, rises at last and throws off its chains, do you call that a weakness? The man who, to rescue his house from the flames, finds his physical strength redoubled, so that he lifts burdens with ease, which, in the absence of excitement, he could scarcely move. He who, under the rage of an insult, attacks and puts to flight half of a score of his enemies, are such persons to be called weak? My good friend, if resistance be strength, how can the slightest degree of resistance be a weakness? Albert looked steadfastly at me and said, Pray forgive me, but I do not see that the examples that you have adduced bear any relation to the question. Very likely, I answered, for I have often been told that my style of illustration borders a little on the absurd. But let us see if we cannot place the matter in another point of view, by inquiring what can be a man's state of mind who resolves to free himself from the burdens of life. A burden often so pleasant to bear, for we cannot otherwise reason fairly upon the subject. Human nature, I continued, has its limits. It is able to endure a certain degree of joy, sorrow, and pain, but becomes annihilated as soon as this measure is exceeded. The question, therefore, is not whether a man is strong or weak, but whether he is able to endure the measure of his sufferings. The suffering may be moral or physical, and in my opinion it is just as absurd to call a man a coward who destroys himself, as to call a man a coward who dies of a malignant fever. Paradox! All paradox! Exclaimed Albert. Not so paradoxical as you imagine, I replied. You allow that we designate a disease as mortal, when nature is so severely attacked, and her strength so far exhausted that she cannot possibly recover from her former condition under any change that may take place. Now, my good friend, apply this to the mind. Observe a man in his natural, isolated condition. Consider how ideas work, and how impressions fasten upon him, till at length a violent passion seizes him, destroying all his powers of calm reflection, and utterly ruining him. It is in vain that a man of sound mind and cool temper understands the condition of such a wretched being. In vain he counsels him. He can no more communicate his own wisdom to him than a healthy man can instill his strength into an invalid, by whose bedside he is seated. Albert thought this too general. I reminded him of a girl who had drowned herself a short time previously, and I related her history. She was a good creature, who had grown up in the narrow sphere of household industry and weekly appointed labour, one who knew no pleasure beyond indulging in a walk on Sundays, arrayed in her best attire, accompanied by her friends, or perhaps joined in the dance now and then at some festival, and chatted away her spare hours with a neighbour, discussing the scandal or the quarrels of the village, trifles sufficient to occupy her heart. At length, the warmth of her nature is influenced by certain new and unknown wishes. Inflamed by the flatteries of men, her former pleasures became by degrees insipid, until at length she meets with a youth to whom she is attracted by an indescribable feeling. Upon him she now rests all of her hopes. She forgets the world around her. She sees, hears, and desires nothing but him and only him. He alone occupies all of her thoughts. Uncorrupted by the idle indulgence of an invigorating vanity, her affection moving steadily toward its object, she hopes to become his, and to realize, in an everlasting union with him, all that happiness which she sought, all that bliss for which she longed. His repeated promises confirm her hopes, embraces, and endearments, which increase the ardour of her desire, overmaster her soul. She floats in a dim, delusive anticipation of her happiness, and her feelings become excited to their utmost tension. She stretches out her arms finally to embrace the object of all her wishes, and her lover forsakes her. Stunned and bewildered, she stands upon a precipice. All this darkness around her, no prospect, no hope, no consolation, forsaken by him in whom her existence was centred. She sees nothing of the wide world before her, thinks nothing of the many individuals who might supply the void in her heart. She feels herself deserted, forsaken by the world, and, blinded and impelled by the agony which wrings her soul, she plunges into the deep, the end of her suffering in the broad embraces of death. See here, Albert, the history of thousands, and tell me, is this not a case of physical infirmity? Nature has no way to escape from the labyrinth. Her powers are exhausted. She can contend no longer, and the poor soul must die. Shame upon him who can look on calmly and exclaim, "The foolish girl! She should have waited. She should have allowed time to wear off the impression. Her despair would have been softened, and she would have found another lover to comfort her." One might as well say, the fool to die of a fever. Why did he not wait till his strength was restored, till his blood became calm? All would then have gone well, and he would still be alive now. Albert, who could not see the justice of the comparison, offered some further objections, and amongst others urged that I had taken the case of a mere ignorant girl. But how any man of sense, of more enlarged views and experience, could be excused, he was unable to comprehend. "My friend," I exclaimed, "man is but man, and whatever be the extent of his reasoning powers, they are of little avail when passion rages within, and he feels himself confined by the narrow limits of nature. It were better, then, but we will talk of this some other time," I said, and caught up my hat. Alas, my heart was full, and we parted without conviction on either side. How rarely in this world do men understand each other. August 15. There can be no doubt that in this world nothing is so indispensable as love. I observed that Charlotte could not lose me without a pang, and the very children have but one wish, that is, that I should visit them again tomorrow. I went this afternoon to tune Charlotte's piano, but I could not do it, for the little ones insisted on my telling them a story, and Charlotte herself urged me to satisfy them. I waited upon them at tea, and they are now as fully contented with me as with Charlotte, and I had told them my very best tale of the princess who was waited upon by dwarfs. I improved myself by this exercise, and am quite surprised at the impression my stories create. If I sometimes invent an incident which I forget upon my next narration, they remind one directly that the story was different before, so that I now endeavour to relate with exactness the same anecdote in the same monotonous tone which never changes. I find by this how much an author injures his work by altering them, even though they are improved in a poetic point of view. The first impression is readily received. We are so constituted that we believe the most incredible things, and, once they are engraved upon memory, woe to him who would endeavour to erase them. August 18. Must it ever be thus, that the source of our happiness must also be the fountain of our misery? The full and ardent sentiment which animated my heart with the love of nature, overwhelming me with a torrent of delight, and which brought all the paradise before me, has now become an insupportable torment, a demon which perpetually pursues and harasses me. When in days gone by I gazed from these rocks upon yonder mountains across the river, and upon the green flowery valley before me, and saw all the nature budding and bursting around, the hills clothed from foot to peak with tall thick forest trees, the valleys in all their varied windings, shaded with the loveliest woods, and the soft river gliding all amongst the lisping reeds, mirroring the beautiful clouds which the same evening breeze wafted across the sky. When I heard the groves about me melodious with the music of birds, and saw the million swarms of insects dancing in the last golden beams of the sun, whose setting rays awoke the humming beetles from their grassy beads, whilst the subdued tumult around directed my attention to the ground, and I there observed the arid rock compelled to yield nutriment to the dry moss, whilst the heath flourished upon the barren sand below me. All this displayed to me the inner warmth which animates all nature, and filled and glowed within my heart. I felt myself exalted by this overflowing fullness to the perception of the Godhead, and the glorious forms of the infinite universe became visible to my soul. Stupendous mountains encompassed me, abysses yawned at my feet, and cataracts fell headlong down before me. Impetuous rivers flowed through the plain, and rocks and mountains resounded from afar. In the depths of the earth I saw innumerable powers in motion, and multiplying to infinity, whilst upon the surface and beneath the heavens there teemed 10,000 varieties of living creatures. Everything around is alive with an infinite number of forms, while mankind fly for security for their petty houses, from the shelter of which they rule in their imaginations over the wide extended universe. Poor fool, in whose pity estimation all the things are little. From the inaccessible mountains across the desert which no mortal foot has trod, far as the confines of the unknown ocean, breathes the spirit of the eternal Creator, and every atom to which he has given existence finds favour in his sight. Ah, how often at the time has the flight of a bird, soaring above my head, inspired me with the desire of being transported to the shores of the immeasurable waters, there to quaff the pleasures of life from the foaming goblet of the infinite, and to partake, if but for a moment even, with the confined powers of my soul, the beatitude of the Creator who accomplishes all things in himself and through himself. My dear friend, the bare recollection of these hours still consoles me. Even this effort to recall those ineffable sensations and give them utterance exalts my soul from above, and makes me doubly feel the intensity of my present anguish. It is as if a curtain had been drawn from before my eyes, and instead of the prospects of eternal life, the abyss of an ever-open grave yawned before me. Can we say of anything that it exists when all passes away, when time, with the speed of a storm, carries all things onward, and our transitory existence, hurried along by the torrent, is either swallowed up by the waves or dashed against the rocks? There is not a moment but praise upon you, and upon all around you, not a moment in which you do not yourself become the destroyer. The most innocent walk deprives of life thousands of poor insects. One step destroys the fabric of the industrious ant, and converts a little world into chaos. No, it is not the great and rare calamities of the world, the floods which sweep away whole villages, the earthquakes which swallow up our towns, that affects me. My heart is wasted by the thought of that destructive power which lies concealed in every part of universal nature. Nature has formed nothing that does not consume itself, and every object near it, so that, surrounded by earth and air, and all the active powers, I wander on my way with an aching heart, and the universe is to me a fearful monster, forever devouring its own offspring. August 21st. In vain do I stretch out my arms toward her when I awaken in the morning from my weary slumbers. In vain do I seek for her at night in my bed, when some innocent dream has happily deceived me, and placed her near me in the fields, when I have seized her hand and covered it with countless kisses, and when I feel for her in the half confusion of sleep, with the happy sense that she is near. Tears flow from my oppressed heart, and, bereft of all comfort, I weep for my future woes. August 22nd. What a misfortune, Wilhelm! My active spirits have degenerated into contented indolence. I cannot be idle, and yet I am unable to set to work. I cannot think. I have no longer any feeling for the beauties of nature, and books are distasteful to me. Once we give up ourselves, we are totally lost. Many a time and oft I have wished I were a common labourer, that, awakening in the morning, I might have but one prospect, one pursuit, one hope for the day which has dawned. I often envy Albert when I see him buried in the heaps of paper and parchments, and I fancy I should be happy were I in his place. Often impressed with this feeling, I have been on the point of writing to you and to the minister for the appointment at the embassy, which you think I might obtain. I believe I might procure it. The minister has long shown a regard for me, and has frequently urged me to seek employment. It is the business of an hour only. Now and then the fable of the horse recurs to me. Weary of liberty, he suffered himself to be saddled and bridled, and was ridden to death for his pains. I know not what to determine upon. For is not this anxiety for change the consequence of that restless spirit which would pursue me equally in every situation of life? August 28th. If my ills would admit of any cure, they would certainly be cured here. This is my birthday, and early in the morning I received a packet from Albert. Upon opening it, I found one of the pink ribbons which Charlotte wore in her dress the first time I saw her, and which I had several times asked for her to give me. With it were 2 volumes of Wettstein's Homer, a book I had often wished for, to save me the inconvenience of carrying the large Ernstein's edition with me upon my walks. You see how they anticipate my wishes, how well they understand all those little attentions of friendship, so superior to the costly presents of the great, which are so humiliating. I kissed the ribbon 1,000 times, and in every breath inhaled the remembrance of those happy and irrevocable days which filled me with the keenest joy. Such, Wilhelm, is our fate. I do not murmur at it. The flowers of life are but visionary. How many pass away and leave no trace behind? How few yield any fruit? And the fruit itself, how rarely does it ripen? And yet there are flowers enough. And is it not strange, my friend, that we should suffer the little that does ripen to rot, decay, and perish unenjoyed? Farewell. This is a glorious summer. I often climb into the trees in Charlotte's orchard, and shake down the pears that hang in the highest branches. She stands below and catches them as they fall. August 30th. Unhappy being that I am! Why do I thus deceive myself? What is to come of all this wild, aimless, endless passion? I cannot pray except to her. My imagination sees nothing but her. All surrounding objects are of no account, except as they relate to her. In this dreamy state I enjoy many happy hours, till at length I feel compelled to tear myself away from her. Ah, Wilhelm, to what does not my heart often compel me? When I have spent several hours in her company, till I feel completely absorbed by her figure, her grace, the divine expression of her thoughts. My mind becomes gradually excited to the highest excesses, my sight grows dim, my hearing confused, my breathing oppressed as if by the hand of a murderer, and my beating heart seeks to obtain relief from my aching senses. I am sometimes unconscious whether I really exist. If in such moments I find no sympathy, and Charlotte does not allow me to enjoy the melancholy consolation of bathing her hand with my tears, I feel compelled to tear myself from her, when I either wander through the country, climb some precipitous cliff, or force a path through the trackless thicket, where I am lacerated and torn by thorns and barriers, and thence I find relief. Sometimes I lie stretched on the ground, overcome with fatigue and dying with thirst. Sometimes, late in the night, I recline against an aged tree in some sequestered forest, to rest my weary limbs, when, exhausted and worn, I sleep till break of day. O Wilhelm, the hermit's cell, his sackcloth and girdle of thorns would be a luxury and an indulgence compared to what I suffer. Adieu. I see no end to this wretchedness, except the grave. End of section 4 of The Sorrows of Young Werther.
Section 5 of The Sorrows of Young Werther. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Section 5. September 3rd. I must away. Thank you, Wilhelm, for determining my wavering purpose. For a whole fortnight I have thought of leaving her. I must away. She has returned to town, and is at the house of a friend. And then Albert. Yes, I must go. September 10th. Oh, what a night, Wilhelm! I can henceforth bear anything. I shall never see her again. Oh, why cannot I fall on your neck, and with floods of tears and raptures give utterance to all the passions which distract my heart? Here I sit gasping for breath, and struggling to compose myself. I wait for day, and at sunrise the horses are to be at the door. And she is sleeping calmly, little suspecting that she has seen me for the last time. I am free. I have had the courage, in an interview of 2 hours' duration, not to betray my intention. And oh, Wilhelm, what a conversation it was! Albert had promised to come to Charlotte in the garden immediately after supper. I was upon the terrace under the tall chestnut trees, and watched the setting sun. I saw him sink for the last time beneath this delightful valley and silent stream. I had often visited the same spot with Charlotte, and witnessed that glorious sight. And now I was walking up and down the very avenue which was so dear to me. A secret sympathy had frequently drawn me thither before I knew Charlotte, and we were delighted when, in our early acquaintance, we discovered that we each loved the same spot, which is indeed as romantic as any that ever captivated the fancy of an artist. From beneath the chestnut trees there is an extensive view, but I remember that I have mentioned all this in a former letter, and have described the tall mass of beech trees at the end, and how the avenue grows darker and darker as it winds its way among them, till it ends in a gloomy recess, which has all the charm of a mysterious solitude. I still remember the strange feeling of melancholy which came over me the first time I entered that dark retreat, at bright midday. I felt some secret foreboding that it would, one day, be to me the scene of some happiness or misery. I had spent half an hour struggling between the contending thoughts of going and returning, when I heard them coming up the terrace. I ran to meet them. I trembled as I took her hand and kissed it. As we reached the top of the terrace, the moon rose from behind the wooded hill. We conversed on many subjects, and, without perceiving it, approached the gloomy recess. Charlotte entered and sat down. Albert seated himself beside her. I did the same, but my agitation did not suffer me to remain long seated. I got up and stood before her, then walked backward and forward, and sat down again. I was restless and miserable. Charlotte drew our attention to the beautiful effect of the moonlight, which threw a silver hue over the terrace in front of us, beyond the beech trees. It was a glorious sight, and was rendered more striking by the darkness which surrounded the spot where we were. We remained for some time silent, when Charlotte observed, "Whenever I walk by moonlight, it brings to my remembrance all my beloved and departed friends, and I am filled with thoughts of death and futurity. We shall live again, Werther," she continued with a firm but feeling voice; "but shall we know one another again? What do you think? What do you say?" "Charlotte," I said, as I took her hand in mine, and my eyes filled with tears, "we shall see each other again: here and hereafter we shall meet again." I could say no more. Why, Wilhelm, should she put this question to me, just at the moment when the fear of our cruel separation filled my heart? And oh, do those departed ones know how we are employed here? Do they know when we are well and happy? Do they know when we recall their memories with the fondest love? In the silent hour of evening the shade of my mother hovers around me, when seated in the midst of my children. I see them assembled near me, as they used to assemble near her, and then I raise my anxious eyes to heaven, and wish she could look down upon us, and witness how I fulfil the promise I made to her in her last moments, to be a mother to her children. With what emotion do I then exclaim, "Pardon, dearest of mothers, pardon me, if I do not adequately supply your place. Alas! I do my utmost. They are clothed and fed, and still better, they are loved and educated. Could you but see, sweet saint, the peace and harmony that dwells amongst us, you would glorify God with the warmest feelings of gratitude, to whom, in your last hour, you addressed such fervent prayers for our happiness." Thus did she express herself; but oh, Wilhelm, who can do justice to her language? How can cold and passionless words convey the heavenly expressions of the spirit? Albert interrupted her gently. "This affects you too deeply, my dear Charlotte. I know your soul dwells on such recollections with intense delight; but I implore Oh, Albert," she continued, "I am sure you do not forget the evenings when we three used to sit at the little round table, when papa was absent, and the little ones had retired. You often had a good book with you, but seldom read it. The conversation of that noble being was preferable to everything. That beautiful, bright, gentle, and yet ever toiling woman. God alone knows how I have supplicated with tears on my nightly couch that I might be like her. I threw myself at her feet, and seizing her hand, bedewed it with 1,000 tears. "Charlotte," I exclaimed, "God's blessing and your mother's spirit are upon you." "Oh, that you had known her!" she said, with a warm pressure of the hand. "She was worthy of being known to you." I thought I should have fainted. Never had I received praise so flattering. She continued, "And yet she was doomed to die in the flower of her youth, when her youngest child was scarcely 6 months old. Her illness was but short, but she was calm and resigned, and it was only for her children, especially the youngest, that she felt unhappy. When her end drew nigh, she bade me bring them to her. I obeyed. The younger ones knew nothing of their approaching loss, while the elder ones were quite overcome with grief. They stood around the bed, and she raised her feeble hands to heaven, and prayed over them. Then, kissing them in turn, she dismissed them, and said to me, "Be you a mother to them." I gave her my hand. "You are promising much, my child," she said, "a mother's fondness and a mother's care. I have often witnessed, by your tears of gratitude, that you know what is a mother's tenderness. Show it to your brothers and sisters, and be dutiful and faithful to your father as a wife. You will be his comfort." She inquired for him. He had retired to conceal his intolerable anguish. He was heartbroken. Albert, you were in the room. She heard some one moving. She inquired who it was, and desired you to approach. She surveyed us both with a look of composure and satisfaction, expressive of her conviction that we should be happy, happy with one another. Albert fell upon her neck and kissed her, and exclaimed, "We are so, and we shall be so." Even Albert, generally so tranquil, had lost his composure, and I was excited beyond expression. "And such a being," she continued, "was to leave us, Werther. Great God, must we thus part with everything we hold dear in this world? Nobody felt this more acutely than the children. They cried and lamented for a long time afterward, complaining that men had carried away their dear mamma." Charlotte rose. It aroused me, but I continued sitting, and held her hand. "Let us go," she said. "It grows late." She attempted to withdraw her hand. I held it still. "We shall see each other again," I exclaimed. "We shall recognise each other under every possible change." "I am going," I continued, "going willingly. But, should I say for ever, perhaps I may not keep my word. Adieu, Charlotte. Adieu, Albert. We shall meet again." "Yes, to morrow, I think," she answered with a smile. To morrow! How I felt the word! Ah, she little thought when she drew her hand away from mine. They walked down the avenue. I stood gazing after them in the moonlight. I threw myself upon the ground and wept. I then sprang up and ran out upon the terrace, and saw, under the shade of the linden trees, her white dress disappearing near the garden gate. I stretched out my arms, and she vanished. End of Section 5. Section 6 of The Sorrows of Young Werther. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Sorrows of Young Werther, by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Section 6. Book 2. October 20. We arrived here yesterday. The ambassador is indisposed, and will not go out for some days. If he was less peevish and morose, all would be well. I see but too plainly that Heaven has destined me to severe trials. But courage! A light heart may bear anything. A light heart! I smile to find such a word proceeding from my pen. A little more light heartedness would render me the happiest being under the sun. But must I despair of my talents and faculties, whilst others of far inferior abilities parade before me with the utmost self-satisfaction? Gracious Providence, to whom I owe all my powers, why didst thou not withhold some of those blessings I possess, and substitute in their place a feeling of self-confidence and contentment? But patience! All will yet be well. For I assure you, my dear friend, you were right. Since I have been obliged to associate continually with other people, and observe what they do, and how they employ themselves, I have become far better satisfied with myself. For we are so constituted by nature that we are ever prone to compare ourselves with others, and our happiness or misery depends very much on the objects and persons around us. On this account nothing is more dangerous than solitude. There our imagination, always disposed to rise, taking a new flight on the wings of fancy, pictures to us a chain of beings of whom we seem the most inferior. All things appear greater than they really are, and all seem superior to us. This operation of the mind is quite natural, and we continually feel our own imperfections, and fancy we perceive in others the qualities we do not possess, attributing to them also all that we enjoy ourselves, that by this process we form the idea of a perfect, happy man, a man, however, who only exists in our own imagination. But when, in spite of weakness and disappointments, we set to work in earnest, and persevere steadily, we often find that, though obliged continually to tack, we make more way than others who have the assistance of wind and tide. And in truth, There can be no greater satisfaction than to keep pace with others, or outstrip them in the race. November 26. I begin to find my situation here more tolerable, considering all circumstances. I find a great advantage in being much occupied, and the number of persons I meet, and their different pursuits, create a varied entertainment for me. I have formed the acquaintance of the Count C., and I esteem him more and more every day. He is a man of strong understanding and great discernment. But though he sees farther than other people, he is not on that account cold in his manner, but capable of inspiring and returning the warmest affection. He appeared interested in me on one occasion when I had to transact some business with him. He perceived at the first word that we understood each other, and that he could converse with me in a different tone from what he used with others. I cannot sufficiently esteem his frank and open kindness to me. It is the greatest and most genuine of pleasures to observe a great mind in sympathy with our own. December 24. As I anticipated, the ambassador occasions me infinite annoyance. He is the most punctilious blockhead under heaven. He does everything step by step, with the trifling minuteness of an old woman, and he is a man whom it is impossible to please, because he is never pleased with himself. I like to do business regularly and cheerfully, and, when it is finished, to leave it; but he constantly returns my papers to me, saying, they will do, but recommending me to look over them again, as one may always improve by using a better word or a more appropriate particle. I then lose all patience, and wish myself at the devil's. Not a conjunction, not an adverb, must be omitted. He has a deadly antipathy to all those transpositions of which I am so fond; and if the music of our periods is not tuned to the established official key, he cannot comprehend our meaning. It is deplorable to be connected with such a fellow. My acquaintance with the Count C. is the only compensation for such an evil. He told me frankly the other day that he was much displeased with the difficulties and delays of the ambassador; that people like him are obstacles, both to themselves and to others. But, he added, one must submit, like a traveller who has to ascend a mountain. If the mountain was not there, the road would be both shorter and pleasanter; but there it is, and he must get over it. The old man perceives the count's partiality for me. This annoys him, and he seizes every opportunity to depreciate the count in my hearing. I naturally defend him, and that only makes matters worse. Yesterday he made me indignant, for he also alluded to me. The count, he said, is a man of the world, and a good man of business. His style is good, and he writes with facility; but, like other geniuses, he has no solid learning. He looked at me with an expression that seemed to ask if I felt the blow. But it did not produce the desired effect. I despise a man who can think and act in such a manner. However, I made a stand, and answered with not a little warmth. The count, I said, was a man entitled to respect, alike for his character and his acquirements. I had never met a person whose mind was stored with more useful and extensive knowledge; who had, in fact, mastered such an infinite variety of subjects, and who yet retained all his activity for the details of ordinary business. This was altogether beyond his comprehension, and I took my leave, lest my anger should be too highly excited by some new absurdity of his. And you are to blame for all this, you who persuaded me to bend my neck to this yoke by preaching a life of activity to me. If the man who plants vegetables, and carries his corn to town on market days, is not more usefully employed than I am, then let me work 10 years longer at the galleys to which I am now chained. Oh, the brilliant wretchedness, the weariness, that one is doomed to witness among the silly people whom we meet in society here! The ambition of rank, how they watch, how they toil, to gain precedence! What poor and contemptible passions are displayed in their utter nakedness! We have a woman here, for example, who never ceases to entertain the company with accounts of her family and her estates. Any stranger would consider her a silly being, whose head was turned by her pretensions to rank and property. But she is in reality even more ridiculous, the daughter of a mere magistrate's clerk from this neighbourhood. I cannot understand how human beings can so debase themselves. Every day I observe more and more the folly of judging of others by ourselves. And I have so much trouble with myself, and my own heart is in such constant agitation, that I am well content to let others pursue their own course, if they only allow me the same privilege. What provokes me most is the unhappy extent to which distinctions of rank are carried. I know perfectly well how necessary are inequalities of condition, and I am sensible of the advantages I myself derive therefrom; but I would not have these institutions prove a barrier to the small chance of happiness which I may enjoy on this earth. I have lately become acquainted with a Miss B., a very agreeable girl, who has retained her natural manners in the midst of artificial life. Our first conversation pleased us both equally, and at taking leave I requested permission to visit her. She consented in so obliging a manner that I waited with impatience for the arrival of the happy moment. She is not a native of this place, but resides here with her aunt. The countenance of the old lady is not prepossessing. I paid her much attention, addressing the greater part of my conversation to her, and in less than half an hour I discovered what her niece subsequently acknowledged to me, that her aged aunt, having but a small fortune and a still smaller share of understanding, enjoys no satisfaction except in the pedigree of her ancestors, no protection save in her noble birth, but no enjoyment but in looking from her castle over the heads of the humble citizens. She was no doubt handsome in her youth, and in her early years probably trifled away her time in rendering many a poor youth the sport of her caprice. In her riper years she has submitted to the yoke of a veteran officer, who in return for her person and her small independence has spent with her what we might designate her age of brass. He is dead, and she is now a widow and deserted. She spends her iron age alone, and would not be approached except for the loveliness of her niece. January 8, 1772. What beings are men, whose whole thoughts are occupied with form and ceremony, who for years together devote their mental and physical exertions to the task of advancing themselves but one step, and endeavouring to occupy a higher place at the table! Not that such persons would otherwise want employment; on the contrary, they give themselves much trouble by neglecting important business for such petty trifles. Last week a question of precedence arose at a sledging party, and all our amusement was spoiled. The silly creatures cannot see that it is not place which constitutes real greatness, since the man who occupies the first place but seldom plays the principal part. How many kings are governed by their ministers? How many ministers by their secretaries? Who in such cases is really the chief? He, as it seems to me, who can see through the others, and possesses strength or skill enough to make their power or passions subservient to the execution of his own designs. January 20. I must write to you from this place, my dear Charlotte, from a small room in a country inn, where I have taken shelter from a severe storm. During my whole residence in that wretched place D, where I lived amongst strangers, strangers indeed to this heart, I never at any time felt the smallest inclination to correspond with you. But in this cottage, in this retirement, in this solitude, with the snow and hail beating against my lattice pane, you are my first thought. The instant I entered, your figure rose up before me, and the remembrance, O my Charlotte, the sacred tender remembrance! Gracious Heaven, restore to me the happy moment of our first acquaintance! Could you but see me, my dear Charlotte, in the whirl of dissipation! How my senses are dried up, but my heart is at no time full. I enjoy no single moment of happiness. All is vain. Nothing touches me. I stand, as it were, before the raree show. I see the little puppets move, and I ask whether it is not an optical illusion. I am amused with these puppets, or rather, I am myself one of them. but when I sometimes grasp my neighbour's hand, I feel that it is not natural, and I withdraw mine with a shudder. In the evening I say I will enjoy the next morning's sunrise, and yet I remain in bed. In the day I promise to ramble by moonlight, and I, nevertheless, remain at home. I know not why I rise, nor why I go to sleep. The leaven which animated my existence is gone. The charm which cheered me in the gloom of night, and aroused me from my morning slumbers, is for ever fled. I have found but one being here to interest me, a Miss B. She resembles you, my dear Charlotte, if any one can possibly resemble you. Ah, you will say, he has learned how to pay fine compliments. And this is partly true. I have been very agreeable lately, as it was not in my power to be otherwise. I have, moreover, a deal of wit, and the ladies say that no one understands flattery better, or falsehoods you would add, since the one accomplishment invariably accompanies the other. But I must tell you of Miss B. She has abundance of soul, which flashes from her deep blue eyes. Her rank is a torment to her, and satisfies no one desire of her heart. She would gladly retire from this whirl of fashion, and we often picture to ourselves a life of undisturbed happiness in distant scenes of rural retirement. And then we speak of you, my dear Charlotte, for she knows you, and renders homage to your merits. But her homage is not exacted, but voluntary. She loves you, and delights to hear you made the subject of conversation. Oh, that I were sitting at your feet in your favourite little room, with the dear children playing around us! If they became troublesome to you, I would tell them some appalling goblin story, and they would crowd round me with silent attention. The sun is setting in glory. His last rays are shining on the snow, which covers the face of the country. The storm is over, and I must return to my dungeon. Adieu. Is Albert with you? And what is he to you? God forgive the question! February 8. For a week past we have had the most wretched weather, but this to me is a blessing; for, during my residence here, not a single fine day has beamed from the heavens, but has been lost to me by the intrusion of somebody. During the severity of rain, sleet, frost, and storm, I congratulate myself that it cannot be worse indoors than abroad, nor worse abroad than it is within doors. So I become reconciled. When the sun rises bright in the morning, and promises a glorious day, I never omit to exclaim, "There, now they have another blessing from heaven, which they will be sure to destroy. They spoil everything, health, fame, happiness, amusement; and they do this generally through folly, ignorance, or imbecility, and always, according to their own account, with the best intentions. I often beseech them, on my bended knees, to be less resolved upon their own destruction." February 17. I fear that my ambassador and I shall not continue much longer together. He is really growing past endurance. He transacts his business in so ridiculous a manner that I am often compelled to contradict him, and do things my own way, and then, of course, he thinks them very ill done. He complained of me lately on this account at court, and the minister gave me a reprimand, a gentle one, it is true, but still a reprimand. In consequence of this, I was about to tender my resignation when I received a letter, to which I submitted with great respect, on account of the high, noble, and generous spirit which dictated it. He endeavoured to soothe my excessive sensibility, paid a tribute to my extreme ideas of duty, of good example, and of perseverance in business, as the fruit of my youthful ardour, an impulse which he did not seek to destroy, but only to moderate, that it might have proper play and be productive of good. So now I am at rest for another week, and no longer at variance with myself. Content and peace of mind are valuable things. I could wish, my dear friend, that these precious jewels were less transitory. February 20. God bless you, my dear friends, and may he grant you that happiness which he denies to me. I thank you, Albert, for having deceived me. I waited for the news that your wedding day was fixed, and I intended on that day, with solemnity, to take down Charlotte's profile from the wall, and to bury it with some other papers I possess. You are now united, and her picture still remains here. Well, let it remain. Why should it not? I know that I am still one of your society, that I still occupy a place uninjured in Charlotte's heart, that I hold the second place therein, and I intend to keep it. Oh, I should become mad if she could forget. Albert, that thought is hell. Farewell, Albert, farewell. Angel of heaven, farewell, Charlotte. End of section 6. Section 7 of The Sorrows of Young Werther. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Section 7. March 15. I have just had a sad adventure which will drive me away from here. I lose all patience. Death! It is not to be remedied, and you alone are to blame, for you urged and impelled me to fill a post for which I was by no means suited. I have now reason to be satisfied, and so have you. But that you may not again attribute this fatality to my impetuous temper, I send you, my dear sir, a plain and simple narration of the affair, as a mere chronicler of facts would describe it. The Count of O likes and distinguishes me. It is well known, and I have mentioned this to you 100 times. Yesterday I dined with him. It is the day on which the nobility are accustomed to assemble at his house in the evening. I never once thought of the assembly, nor that we subalterns did not belong to such society. Well, I dined with the Count, and after dinner we adjourned to the large hall. We walked up and down together, and I conversed with him and with Colonel B., who joined us. And in this manner the hour for the assembly approached. God knows I was thinking of nothing when who should enter but the honourable lady, accompanied by her noble husband and their silly scheming daughter, with her small waist and flat neck; and with disdainful looks and a haughty air they passed me by. As I heartily detest the whole race, I determined upon going away, and only waited till the Count had disengaged himself from their impertinent prattle to take leave, when the agreeable Miss B. came in. As I never meet her without experiencing a heartfelt pleasure, I stayed and talked to her, leaning over the back of her chair, and did not perceive, till after some time, that she seemed a little confused, and ceased to answer me with her usual ease of manner. I was struck with it. Heavens! I said to myself, can she too be like the rest? I felt annoyed, and was about to withdraw, but I remained, notwithstanding, forming excuses for her conduct, fancying she did not mean it, and still hoping to receive some friendly recognition. The rest of the company now arrived. There was the Baron F., in an entire suit that dated from the coronation of Francis I., the Chancellor N., with his deaf wife, the shabbily dressed I., whose old-fashioned coat bore evidence of modern repairs. This crowned the whole. I conversed with some of my acquaintances, but they addressed me laconically. I was engaged in observing Miss B., and did not notice that the women were whispering at the end of the room, that the murmur extended by degrees to the men, that Madame S. addressed the Count with much warmth (this was all related to me subsequently by Miss B.), till at length the Count came up to me, and took me to the window. "You know our ridiculous customs," he said. "I perceive the company is rather displeased at your being here. I would not on any account—" "I beg your Excellency's pardon," I exclaimed. "I ought to have thought of this before, but I know you will forgive this little inattention. I was going," I added, "some time ago, but my evil genius detained me." And I smiled and bowed, to take my leave. He shook me by the hand, in a manner which expressed everything. I hastened at once from the illustrious assembly, sprang into a carriage, and drove to M. I contemplated the setting sun from the top of the hill, and read that beautiful passage in Homer, where Ulysses is entertained by the hospitable herdsman. This was indeed delightful. I returned home to supper in the evening, but few persons were assembled in the room. They had turned up a corner of the tablecloth, and were playing at dice. The good-natured A came in. He laid down his hat when he saw me, approached me, and said in a low tone, "You have met with a disagreeable adventure." "I?" I exclaimed. "The Count obliged you to withdraw from the assembly." "Deuce take the assembly," said I. "I was very glad to be gone." "I am delighted," he added, "that you take it so lightly. I am only sorry that it is already so much spoken of." The circumstance then began to pain me. I fancied that every one who sat down, and even looked at me, was thinking of this incident, and my heart became embittered. And now I could plunge a dagger into my bosom, when I hear myself everywhere pitied, and observe the triumph of my enemies, who say that this is always the case with vain persons, whose heads are turned with conceit, who affect to despise forms, and such petty idle nonsense. Say what you will of fortitude, but show me the man who can patiently endure the laughter of fools, when they have obtained an advantage over him. 'Tis only when their nonsense is without foundation that one can suffer it without complaint. March 16. Everything conspires against me. I met Miss B. walking to day. I could not help joining her, and when we were at a little distance from her companions, I expressed my sense of her altered manner toward me. "O Werther," she said in a tone of emotion, "you who know my heart, how could you so ill interpret my distress? What did I not suffer for you, from the moment you entered the room? I foresaw it all; 100 times was I on the point of mentioning it to you. I knew that the S's and the T's, with their husbands, would quit the room rather than remain in your company. I knew that the Count would not break with them, and now so much is said about it." "How?" I exclaimed, and endeavoured to conceal my emotion, for all that Adeline had mentioned to me yesterday recurred to me painfully at that moment. "Oh, how much it has already cost me!" said this amiable girl, while her eyes filled with tears. I could scarcely contain myself, and was ready to throw myself at her feet. "Explain yourself!" I cried. Tears flowed down her cheeks. I became quite frantic. She wiped them away without attempting to conceal them. "You know my aunt," she continued. "She was present. And in what light does she consider the affair? Last night and this morning, Werther, I was compelled to listen to a lecture upon my acquaintance with you. I have been obliged to hear you condemned and depreciated, and I could not, I dared not, say much in your defence." Every word she uttered was a dagger to my heart. She did not feel what a mercy it would have been to conceal everything from me. She told me, in addition, all the impertinence that would be further circulated, and how the malicious would triumph, how they would rejoice over the punishment of my pride, over my humiliation for that want of esteem for others with which I had often been reproached. To hear all this, Wilhelm, uttered by her in a voice of the most sincere sympathy, awakened all my passions, and I am still in a state of extreme excitement. I wish I could find a man to jeer me about this event. I would sacrifice him to my resentment. The sight of his blood might possibly be a relief to my fury. 100 times have I seized a dagger, to give ease to this oppressed heart. Naturalists tell of a noble race of horses that instinctively open a vein with their teeth, when heated and exhausted by a long course, in order to breathe more freely. I am often tempted to open a vein, to procure for myself everlasting liberty. March 24. I have tendered my resignation to the Count. I hope it will be accepted, and you will forgive me for not having previously consulted you. It is necessary I should leave this place. I know all you will urge me to stay, and therefore I beg you will soften this news to my mother. I am unable to do anything for myself. How then should I be competent to assist others? It will afflict her that I should have interrupted that career which would have made me first a privy councillor and then minister, and that I should look behind me in place of advancing. Argue as you will, combine all the reasons which should have induced me to remain, I am going, that is sufficient. But, that you may not be ignorant of my destination, I may mention that the Prince of is here. He is much pleased with my company, and having heard of my intention to resign, he has invited me to his country house, to pass the spring months with him. I shall be left completely my own master, and as we agree on all subjects but one, I shall try my fortune and accompany him. April 19. Thanks for both your letters. I delayed my reply, and withheld this letter till I should obtain an answer from the court. I feared my mother might apply to the minister to defeat my purpose. But my request is granted, my resignation is accepted. I shall not recount with what reluctance it was accorded, nor relate what the minister has written. You would only renew your lamentations. The crown prince has sent me a present of 25 ducats, and indeed such goodness has affected me to tears. For this reason I shall not require from my mother the money for which I lately applied. May 5. I leave this place tomorrow, and as my native place is only 6 miles from the high road, I intend to visit it once more, and recall the happy dreams of my childhood. I shall enter at the same gate through which I came with my mother, when, after my father's death, she left that delightful retreat to immure herself in your melancholy town. Adieu, my dear friend. You shall hear of my future career. May 9. I have paid my visit to my native place with all the devotion of a pilgrim, and have experienced many unexpected emotions. Near the great elm tree, which is 1/4 league from the village, I got out of the carriage and sent it on before, that alone and on foot I might enjoy vividly and heartily all the pleasure of my recollections. I stood there under that same elm which was formerly the term and object of my walks. How things have since changed! Then, in happy ignorance, I sighed for a world I did not know, where I hoped to find every pleasure and enjoyment which my heart could desire; and now, on my return from that wide world, O my friend, how many disappointed hopes and unsuccessful plans have I brought back! As I contemplated the mountains which lay stretched out before me, I thought how often they had been the object of my dearest desires. Here used I to sit for hours together with my eyes bent upon them, ardently longing to wander in the shade of those woods, to lose myself in those valleys, which form so delightful an object in the distance. With what reluctance did I leave this charming spot, when my hour of recreation was over, and my leave of absence expired! I drew near to the village. All the well-known old summer-houses and gardens were recognized then. I disliked the new ones, and all other alterations which had taken place. I entered the village, and all my former feelings returned. I cannot, my dear friend, enter into details. Charming as were my sensations, they would be dull in the narration. I had intended to lodge in the market-place, near our old house. As soon as I entered, I perceived that the schoolroom, where our childhood had been taught by that good old woman, was converted into a shop. I called to mind the sorrow, the heaviness, the tears, and oppression of heart which I experienced in that confinement. Every step produced some particular impression. A pilgrim in the Holy Land does not meet so many spots pregnant with tender recollections, and his soul is hardly moved with greater devotion. One incident will serve for illustration. I followed the course of a stream to a farm, formerly a delightful walk of mine, and paused at the spot where, when boys, we used to amuse ourselves making ducks and drakes upon the water. I recollected so well how I used formerly to watch the course of that same stream, following it with inquiring eagerness, forming romantic ideas of the countries it was to pass through; but my imagination was soon exhausted, while the water continued flowing farther and farther on, till my fancy became bewildered by the contemplation of an invisible distance. Exactly such, my dear friend, so happy and so confined, were the thoughts of our good ancestors. Their feelings and their poetry were fresh as childhood. And, when Ulysses talks of the immeasurable sea and boundless earth, his epithets are true, natural, deeply felt, and mysterious. Of what importance is it that I have learned, with every schoolboy, that the world is round? Man needs but little earth for enjoyment, and still less for his final repose. I am at present with the prince at his hunting lodge. He is a man with whom one can live happily. He is honest and unaffected. There are, however, some strange characters about him, whom I cannot at all understand. They do not seem vicious, and yet they do not carry the appearance of thoroughly honest men. Sometimes I am disposed to believe them honest, and yet I cannot persuade myself to confide in them. It grieves me to hear the prince occasionally talk of things which he has only read or heard of, and always with the same view in which they have been represented by others. He values my understanding and talents more highly than my heart, but I am proud of the latter only. It is the sole source of everything of our strength, happiness, and misery. All the knowledge I possess every one else can acquire, but my heart is exclusively my own. May 25. I have had a plan in my head of which I did not intend to speak to you until it was accomplished. Now that it has failed, I may as well mention it. I wished to enter the army, and had long been desirous of taking the step. This indeed was the chief reason for my coming here with the prince, as he is a general in the service. I communicated my design to him during one of our walks together. He disapproved of it, and it would have been actual madness not to have listened to his reasons. June 11. Say what you will, I can remain here no longer. Why should I remain? Time hangs heavy upon my hands. The prince is as gracious to me as any one could be, and yet I am not at my ease. There is indeed nothing in common between us. He is a man of understanding, but quite of the ordinary kind. His conversation affords me no more amusement than I should derive from the perusal of a well-written book. I shall remain here a week longer, and then start again on my travels. My drawings are the best things I have done since I came here. The prince has a taste for the arts, and would improve if his mind were not fettered by cold rules and mere technical ideas. I often lose patience when, with a glowing imagination, I am giving expression to art and nature, he interferes with learned suggestions, and uses at random the technical phraseology of artists. July 16. Once more I am a wanderer, a pilgrim through the world. But what else are you? July 18. Whither am I going? I will tell you in confidence. I am obliged to continue a fortnight longer here, and then I think it would be better for me to visit the mines in . But I am only deluding myself thus. The fact is, I wish to be near Charlotte again. That is all. I smile at the suggestions of my heart, and obey its dictates. July 29. No, no, it is yet well, all is well. I, her husband! O God, who gave me being, if thou hadst destined this happiness for me, my whole life would have been one continual thanksgiving. But I will not murmur. Forgive these tears, forgive these fruitless wishes. She, my wife! Oh, the very thought of folding that dearest of heaven's creatures in my arms! Dear Wilhelm, my whole frame feels convulsed when I see Albert put his arms around her slender waist. And shall I avow it? Why should I not, Wilhelm? She would have been happier with me than with him. Albert is not the man to satisfy the wishes of such a heart. He wants a certain sensibility. He wants... In short, their hearts do not beat in unison. How often, my dear friend, I am reading a passage from some interesting book, when my heart and Charlotte's seem to meet, and in 100 other instances when our sentiments were unfolded by the story of some fictitious character, have I felt that we were made for each other. My dear Wilhelm, he loves her with his whole soul, and what does not such a love deserve? I have been interrupted by an insufferable visit. I have dried my tears and composed my thoughts. Adieu, my best friend. End of section 7. Section 8 of the Sorrows of Young Werther. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Barry Eads. The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Section 8. August 4. I am not alone unfortunate. All men are disappointed in their hopes, and deceived in their expectations. I have paid a visit to my good old woman under the lime trees. The eldest boy ran out to meet me. His exclamation of joy brought out his mother, but she had a very melancholy look. Her first word was, "Alas, dear sir, my little John is dead." He was the youngest of her children. I was silent. "And my husband has returned from Switzerland without any money. And, if some kind people had not assisted him, he must have begged his way home. He was taken ill with fever on his journey." I could answer nothing, but made the little one a present. She invited me to take some fruit. I complied, and left the place with a sorrowful heart. August 21. My sensations are constantly changing. Sometimes a happy prospect opens before me, but alas, it is only for a moment, and then, when I am lost in reverie, I cannot help saying to myself, "If Albert were to die! Yes, she would become, and I should be," and so I pursue a chimera, till it leads me to the edge of a precipice at which I shudder. When I pass through the same gate and walk along the same road which first conducted me to Charlotte, my heart sinks within me at the change that has since taken place. All is altered. No sentiment, no pulsation of my heart is the same. My sensations are such as would occur to some departed prince, whose spirit should return to visit the superb palace which he had built in happy times, adorned with costly magnificence, and left to a beloved son, but whose glory he should find departed, and its halls deserted and in ruins. September 3rd. I sometimes cannot understand how she can love another, how she dares love another, when I love nothing in this world so completely, so devotedly, as I love her, when I know only her, and have no other possession. September 4th. It is even so. As nature puts on her autumn tints, it becomes autumn with me and around me. My leaves are sere and yellow, and the neighbouring trees are divested of their foliage. Do you remember my writing to you about a peasant boy, shortly after my arrival here? I have just made inquiries about him in Walheim. They say he has been dismissed from his service, and is now avoided by every one. I met him yesterday on the road, going to a neighbouring village. I spoke to him, and he told me his story. It interested me exceedingly, as you will easily understand when I repeat it to you. But why should I trouble you? Why should I not reserve all my sorrow for myself? Why should I continue to give you occasion to pity and blame me? But no matter. This also is part of my destiny. At first the peasant lad answered my inquiries with a sort of subdued melancholy, which seemed to me the mark of a timid disposition. But as we grew to understand each other, he spoke with less reserve, and openly confessed his faults, and lamented his misfortune. I wish, my dear friend, I could give proper expression to his language. He told me, with a sort of pleasurable recollection, that after my departure his passion for his mistress increased daily, until at last he neither knew what he did nor what he said, nor what was to become of him. He could neither eat nor drink nor sleep. He felt a sense of suffocation. He disobeyed all orders, and forgot all commands involuntarily. He seemed as if pursued by an evil spirit, till one day, knowing that his mistress had gone to an upper chamber, he had followed, or rather been drawn after her. As she proved deaf to his entreaties, he had recourse to violence. He knows not what happened, but he called God to witness that his intentions to her were honourable, and that he desired nothing more sincerely than that they should marry and pass their lives together. When he had come to this point, he began to hesitate, as if there was something, which he could not courage to utter, till at length he acknowledged with some confusion certain little confidences she had encouraged, and liberties she had allowed. He broke off 2 or 3 times in his narration, and assured me most earnestly that he had no wish to make her bad, as he termed it, for he loved her still as sincerely as ever; that the tale had never before escaped his lips, and was only now told to convince me that he was not utterly lost and abandoned. And here, my dear friend, I must commence the old song which you know I utter eternally. If I could only represent the man as he stood and stands now before me, could I only give his true expressions, you would feel compelled to sympathize in his fate. But enough. You, who know my misfortune and my disposition, can easily comprehend the attraction which draws me toward every unfortunate being, but particularly toward him whose story I have recounted. On perusing this letter a second time, I find I have omitted the conclusion of my tale, but it is easily supplied. She became reserved toward him at the instigation of her brother, who had long hated him, and desired his expulsion from the house, fearing that his sister's second marriage might deprive his children of the handsome fortune they expected from her, as she is childless. He was dismissed at length, and the whole affair occasioned so much scandal that the mistress dared not take him back, even if she had wished it. She has since hired another servant, with whom, they say, her brother is equally displeased, and whom she is likely to marry; but my informant assures me that he himself is determined not to survive such a catastrophe. This story is neither exaggerated nor embellished. Indeed, I have weakened and impaired it in the narration, by the necessity of using the more refined expressions of society. This love, then, this constancy, this passion, is no poetical fiction. It is actual, and dwells in its greatest purity amongst that class of mankind whom we term rude, uneducated. We are the educated, not the perverted. But read this story with attention, I implore you. I am tranquil to day, for I have been employed upon this narration. You see by my writing that I am not so agitated as usual. I read and re-read this tale, Wilhelm. It is the history of your friend. My fortune has been and will be similar, and I am neither half so brave nor half so determined as the poor wretch with whom I hesitate to compare myself. September 5. Charlotte had written a letter to her husband in the country, where he was detained by business. It commenced, "My dearest love, return as soon as possible. I await you with 1,000 raptures." A friend who arrived brought word that for certain reasons he could not return immediately. Charlotte's letter was not forwarded, and the same evening it fell into my hands. I read it and smiled. She asked the reason. "What a heavenly treasure is imagination!" I exclaimed. I fancied for a moment that this was written to me. She paused, and seemed displeased. I was silent. September 6. It cost me much to part with the blue coat which I wore the first time I danced with Charlotte, but I could not possibly wear it any longer. But I have ordered a new one, precisely similar, even to the collar and sleeves, as well as a new waistcoat and pantaloons. But it does not produce the same effect upon me. I know not how it is, but I hope in time I shall like it better. September 12. She has been absent for some days. She went to meet Albert. To-day I visited her. She rose to receive me, and I kissed her hand most tenderly. A canary at the moment flew from a mirror and settled upon her shoulder. "Here is a new friend," she observed, while she made him perch upon her hand. "He is a present for the children. What a dear he is! Look at him. When I feed him he flutters with his wings and pecks so nicely. He kisses me too, only look." She held the bird to her mouth, and he pressed her sweet lips with so much fervour that he seemed to feel the excess of bliss which he enjoyed. "He shall kiss you too," she added, and then she held the bird toward me. His little beak moved from her mouth to mine, and the delightful sensation seemed like the forerunner of the sweetest bliss. A kiss, I observed, does not seem to satisfy him. He wishes for food, and seems disappointed by these unsatisfactory endearments. But he eats out of my mouth, she continued, and extended her lips to him containing seed, and she smiled with all the charm of a being who has allowed an innocent participation of her love. I turned my face away. She should not act thus. She ought not to excite my imagination with such displays of heavenly innocence and happiness, nor awaken my heart from its slumbers, in which it dreams of the worthlessness of life. And why not? Because she knows how much I love her. September 15. It makes me wretched, Wilhelm, to think that there should be men incapable of appreciating the few things which possess a real value in life. You remember the walnut trees at S., under which I used to sit with Charlotte, during my visits to the worthy old vicar. Those glorious trees, the very sight of which has so often filled my heart with joy, how they adorned and refreshed the parsonage yard, with their wide extended branches! And how pleasing was our remembrance of the good old pastor, by whose hands they were planted so many years ago! The schoolmaster has frequently mentioned his name. He had it from his grandfather. He must have been a most excellent man, and under the shade of those old trees his memory was ever venerated by me. The schoolmaster informed us yesterday, with tears in his eyes, that those trees had been felled. Yes, cut to the ground. I could, in my wrath, have slain the monster who struck the first stroke. And I must endure this. I, who, if I had had two such trees in my own court, and one had died from old age, should have wept with real affliction. But there is some comfort left. Such a thing is sentiment. The whole village murmurs at the misfortune, and I hope the vicar's wife will soon find, by the cessation of the villagers' presence, how much she has wounded the feelings of the neighbourhood. It was she who did it, the wife of the present incumbent. Our good old man is dead. A tall sickly creature, who is so far right to disregard the world as the world totally disregards her. The silly being affects to be learned, pretends to examine the canonical books, lends her aid toward the new-fashioned reformation of Christendom, moral and critical, and shrugs up her shoulders at the mention of Lavater's enthusiasm. Her health is destroyed, on account of which she is prevented from having any enjoyment here below. Only such a creature could have cut down my walnut trees. I can never pardon it. Here her reasons. The falling leaves made the court wet and dirty. The branches obstructed the light. Boys threw stones at the nuts when they were ripe, and the noise affected her nerves, and disturbed her profound meditations, when she was weighing the difficulties of Kennicott, Simler, and Michaelis. Finding that all the parish, particularly the old people, were displeased, I asked why they allowed it. "Ah, sir," they replied, "when the steward orders, what can we poor peasants do?" But one thing has happened well. The steward and the vicar, who for once thought to reap some advantage from the caprices of his wife, intended to divide the trees between them. The revenue office, being informed of it, revived an old claim to the ground where the trees had stood, and sold them to the best bidder. There they still lie on the ground. If I were the sovereign, I should know how to deal with them all, vicar, steward, and revenue office. Sovereign, did I say? I should, in that case, care little about the trees that grew in the country. October 10. Only to gaze upon her dark eyes is to me a source of happiness. And what grieves me is, that Albert does not seem so happy as he hoped to be, as I should have been, if... I am no friend to these pauses, but here I cannot express it otherwise, and probably I am explicit enough. October 12. Ossian has superseded Homer in my heart. To what a world does the illustrious bard carry me! To wander over pathless wilds, surrounded by impetuous whirlwinds, where by the feeble light of the moon we see the spirits of our ancestors; to hear from the mountain tops, mid the roar of torrents, their plaintive sounds issuing from deep caverns, and the sorrowful lamentations of a maiden, who sighs and expires on the mossy tomb of the warrior by whom she was adored. I meet this bard with silver hair. He wanders in the valley. He seeks the footsteps of his fathers, and alas, he finds only their tombs. Then, contemplating the pale moon as she sinks beneath the waves of the rolling sea, the memory of bygone days strikes the mind of the hero, days when approaching danger invigorated the brave, and the moon shone upon his bark laden with spoils, and returning in triumph. When I read in his countenance deep sorrow, when I see his dying glory sink exhausted into the grave, as he inhales new and heart-thrilling delight from his approaching union with his beloved, and he casts a look on the cold earth and the tall grass which is so soon to cover him, and then exclaims, "The traveller will come, he will come who has seen my beauty, and he will ask, Where is the bard, where is the illustrious son of Fingal? He will walk over my tomb, and will seek me in vain." Then, O my friend, I could instantly, like a true and noble knight, draw my sword, and deliver my prince from the long and painful languor of a living death, and dismiss my own soul to follow the demigod whom my hand had set free. October 19. Alas! the void, the fearful void which I feel in my bosom! Sometimes I think, if I could only once, but once, press her to my heart, this dreadful void would be filled. October 26. Yes, I feel certain, Wilhelm, and every day I become more certain, that the existence of any being whatever is of very little consequence. A friend of Charlotte's called to see her just now. I withdrew into a neighbouring apartment, and took up a book. But finding I could not read, I sat down to write. I heard them converse in an undertone. They spoke upon indifferent topics, and retailed the news of the town. One was going to be married, another was ill, very ill. She had a dry cough. Her face was growing thinner daily, and she had occasional fits. N is very unwell too, said Charlotte. His limbs begin to swell already, answered the other, and my lively imagination carried me at once to the beds of the infirm. There I see them struggling against death, with all the agonies of pain and horror, and these women, Wilhelm, talk of all this with as much indifference as one would mention the death of a stranger. And when I look around the apartment where I now am, when I see Charlotte's apparel lying before me, and Albert's writings, and all those articles of furniture which are so familiar to me, even to the very inkstand which I am using, when I think what I am to this family, everything. My friends esteem me, I often contribute to their happiness, and my heart seems as if it could not beat without them. And yet, if I were to die, if I were to be summoned from the midst of this circle, would they feel, or how long would they feel, the void which my loss would make in their existence? How long? Yes, such is the frailty of man, that even there, where he has the greatest consciousness of his own being, where he makes the strongest and most forcible impression, even in the memory, in the heart of his beloved, there also he must perish, vanish, and that quickly. October 27. I could tear open my bosom with vexation to think how little we are capable of influencing the feelings of each other. No one can communicate to me those sensations of love, joy, rapture, and delight which I do not naturally possess, and though my heart may glow with the most lively affection, I cannot make the happiness of one in whom the same warmth is not inherent. October 27, evening. I possess so much, but my love for her absorbs it all. I possess so much, but without her I have nothing. October 30. 100 times have I been on the point of embracing her. Heavens! What a torment it is to see so much loveliness passing and repassing before us, and yet dare not to lay hold of it! And laying hold is the most natural of human instincts. Do not children touch everything they see? And I. End of section 8.